welcome to week 31 of our second year of our journey through the Word. This week we continue to sit with Paul as he writes his letters to his spiritual sons. And we see him finish his letter this week to his son, his spiritual son, Timothy, as he's writing his second letter to him. It's obvious that Paul is mentoring Timothy as Paul is getting ready to hand on the baton of ministry to those that are younger and who will continue after he's gone. Paul has suffered much for the sake of the gospel, and he knows that as Timothy takes over and continues on bringing the gospel, that he too is going to have to face a lot of sufferings and difficulties. And so Paul begins to prepare him for those things, and he uses three different analogies as he's telling Timothy what he needs to embrace in preparation. He says, first of all, that he's to suffer as a good soldier. And he says a good soldier doesn't entangle himself in everyday life. As we read this, it would make more sense to us if we take it back into the time period that Paul is speaking about. Because a soldier was very different in the time of Paul, and also the way a soldier was enlisted, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what they would do is that when the Senate would commission a general to go on a campaign, then the general would go out and he would make these signs. It's where graffiti came from, and they would write on the wall that there was a commission and that there was a campaign coming up, and this was the general of that campaign. And then men could decide, did they want to go on that campaign or did they not want to go on that campaign? Did they want to follow that general or did they not want to follow that general? If they chose to follow that general on this campaign, then they would go to Mars Field. They would do this a considerable length of time before the campaign was to begin, because on Mars Field, this is when they believed that they would be transformed from civilian into a soldier, and they would then take on a different diet. Obviously, they would have to sleep in tents or in open fields, and so they would begin also to groom themselves physically for what was about to come into their lives. And so they would be transformed from civilian into a soldier. Also, when they returned from their campaign, they would again go to Mars Field. Why Mars Field? Because Mars was the god of war. And so they would leave from Mars Field, but then they would come back to Mars Field and once again spend time at Mars Field as they would again transform back into civilian life. Soldiers didn't eat certain things, like they didn't eat meat. They ate lots of bread and cheese, lots of pizza. And so they even their diet was different. And so when Paul says they didn't entangle themselves in everyday life, he means on every level, what they wore, what they ate, what they did. And so they had a focus. And he also goes on to say that a soldier has one goal, which is to please the general who enlisted him. Once again, to understand this, we need to understand the Roman army. When that general put on the wall and the graffiti and that he was going to head a campaign, and if you decided you were going on that campaign with him, then you enlisted under that general. Your allegiance was to that general, even more so than even to Rome. And so these men would fight for their general, which is why when you go into history and you see some of the civil wars that started at that time, for instance, with Julius Caesar, his army, they were true to him. They wanted to please the general who enlisted them. There's so much to be said of that. But just know that when Paul says you have to have one goal, and that's to please the general who enlisted you. And he knew that Timothy would understand the general that enlisted you is God. Be true to him. And that's the only goal you have, is to please him. And then he goes on to say, also be a good athlete. Now there's different disciplines and different goals to an athlete than there is to a soldier. An athlete exercises to build strength. They also discipline themselves on a regular basis to build endurance. But he also has to educate himself so he knows the rules and understands the rules. An athlete can have all the strength and he can build himself up to have all the endurance. But if he doesn't know the rules and he breaks the rules of the athletic games, then he's disqualified. And so Paul says, make sure you're strengthened, make sure you have endurance, but make sure you know the rules, knowing that the rules are found in the Word of God. But then he goes on to say, and be a good farmer. Again, the farmer has different responsibilities and goals than an athlete or a soldier. A farmer knows he has to prepare the soil. He knows he has to plant with a purpose and with a goal. And he also knows that he has to wait patiently in faith for the harvest of what he's planted. There are so many things. We could take each one of those things and do a total message, if not a total series, on each one of them individually. And so Paul is instructing Timothy on how to prepare for the work that God has called him to do. In 2 Timothy 2:15, as Paul is writing, he pens these words: be diligent to present yourself approved to God, as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, handling accurately the word of truth. And so Paul is encouraging him, be diligent. If we look at that word diligent, it means a constant, steady, wholehearted, urgent effort to see the task completed. What is the completed task? That I might stand before God as a workman who doesn't have to be ashamed because I handled his word accurately. May that be the goal of every leader and teacher who's called to ministry today. God has given Paul also a glimpse into end times, which speaks of the times that we're living in. He says that in end times, it's going to be a difficult time. And he goes on to describe what that time will be like. He says evil will be rampant and people will not want to hear truth any longer. And people in churches will pervert the gospel, tainting it with their own agendas. These are things that we see today that are so rampant in our world as well as in our churches. And he mentions by name two men, Jannes and Jambres. We find these two names also mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other than reading them here in Paul's letter, we don't see them any other time in our Masoretic text. But obviously, these two names were well known. They did find them in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who were these two men? These were the sorcerers who opposed Moses when Moses went to Pharaoh and said, let God's people go. Origen, who lived in 185 to 253 AD, also speaks of a book that was called the Book of Jannes and Jambres. And obviously this book was well known at his time. These names were well known at the time of the occupants of Qumran, which were at the time of Christ. So we know that these names were found in other documents and other writings. We also know that also Josephus mentions these same two names as the ones who had opposed Moses, the two sorcerers who had opposed Moses. And so in this second letter, we find that Paul mentions these two names, but he also mentions the names of 22 people. That's a lot of people for the short letter that he's writing to Timothy. He mentions 22 people by name. Some of them are faithful Christians who are serving God, while others are the enemies of the gospel. And so Paul is making sure that Paul knows who to trust and who to watch out for. And with these final words, Paul again is grooming Timothy to take that role as the leader who will lead God's people. And at this point, Paul says goodbye to Timothy, and he begins his letter to his other spiritual son, Titus. The letter to Titus was most likely written at the same time. Who is Titus? Well, we know that Titus was a convert of Paul when he was in Antioch. We also know that Titus accompanied Paul and Barnabas when they went back to Jerusalem to present their gospel for scrutiny to the elders that were in Jerusalem. And so Titus accompanied him there. And then we find that Titus then began to travel with Paul as one of the traveling companions. We know that Titus ended up with a real bond with the people in Corinth. We read this in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 13 through 15, if you want to refresh your memory. We also know that Paul left Titus in Crete. Some of you might remember Crete. You might remember when Paul was taken prisoner and they were taking him from Jerusalem and taking him to Rome. And on the journey to Rome, they were near Crete, and Paul tells them, don't leave Crete, stay here. They didn't take his advice. They end up in a terrible shipwreck. And yet we learn by this that obviously Paul had some influence on the people in Crete and that a church was beginning to grow there. And so just as Paul left Timothy at Ephesus, we find that Paul leaves Titus in Crete to bring structure to the young church that is there. And he tells him, as he did with Timothy, he gives him the instructions for how do you appoint leaders and elders, bishops, pastors. And so he gives him the instructions and the qualifications, and also instructs him of what the church should act like and look like. And as Paul did with Timothy, Paul ends his letter to Titus mentioning several of the people who make up the network of ministers who are carrying the gospel and are doing as Paul is doing. And it's here that we say goodbye to Paul for a time, although we will meet up with him again before we complete our journey this year. And so now we come to the second part of our series. Our series that we're going through is called Heart to Heart. As we looked at Paul, we were looking at a father's heart. In the second part of our series, now we're going to look at a son's heart. And in this part of our journey, we begin to walk with Solomon, and as he pens the Proverbs. What are Proverbs? As we look at the word Proverbs, mashal, we find that the word literally means to be like, or to represent something, or to be comparable to something. And so Solomon has a desire to impart wisdom and understanding. And as he begins to write the Proverbs, he gives us the 14 different purposes of the Proverbs. And so as you begin the book of Proverbs, pay attention to those 14 purposes. What are the 14 things that the Proverbs are to do for us? Solomon's desire for wisdom was planted in him by his father David. I want you to listen to David's charge to Solomon as we read 1 Chronicles 22, 11 through 12. Now, my son, Yahweh be with you, that you may be successful and build the house of Yahweh, your God, just as he has spoken concerning you. Only Yahweh give you discretion and understanding, and give you charge over Israel, so that you may keep the law of Yahweh, your God. Did you see David's prayer for his son Solomon? As he says, only Yahweh give you discretion and understanding. And so David's desire was that Solomon walk in discretion, wisdom, and understanding. And as Solomon writes the Proverbs, we hear the voice of David in the background. We also hear the voice of his mother, Bathsheba. More than once, Solomon encourages us to hear the instructions of our father and the teachings of our mother. And as you read that, remember who is Solomon's father and who is Solomon's mother. By the time we get to Proverbs chapter 2, we're given the 8 things we must do to attain wisdom. And then he gives us the 4 things that God does for those who gain wisdom. And then he gives us the 4 benefits of those who walk in wisdom, knowledge, discretion, and understanding. So you might want to watch for these lists and enumerate them, write them down. By the time we get to Proverbs chapter 3, we begin to see that Proverbs is filled with antitheses. What is an antithesis? An antithesis is a comparison of opposites, also sometimes called parallelism. And so it's taking one thing and comparing it or setting it on a parallel to another thing. Let me give you a perfect example of an antithesis. In Proverbs 4, verses 18 through 19, it says, "The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." And so we see the comparison of opposites. This happens time and time again as we go through the book of Proverbs. And throughout the book of Proverbs, there's something else we need to be aware of and watch for, because Solomon not only is showing us wisdom, but he is also showing us the 5 levels of fools. We will see this again over and over again throughout the Proverbs. The only problem is that sometimes the word fool, you'll come to the word fool, and it will be translated fool, but it won't be the same Hebrew word for fool. And so we need to know, what are these levels of a fool? Sometimes we'll be able to tell it by the attributes. But let me give you the 5 levels of a fool so you can watch for them as you continue on through the book of Proverbs. The first level of a fool is called a petit. A petit. It simply means the simple or the naive. This fool is one who is very open-minded, very gullible. They just believe everything. Well, if it's on the internet, must be true. These are the simple, the naive. These are the ones who lack understanding. Then we have another level of a fool called the Kasil. The Kasil is often referred to as being foolish or stupid. This is the one who hates wisdom because it demands change, and they don't want to change. He's what we would refer to as the obstinate fool. Then we come to the next level of fool. We see this one quite a number of times throughout the book of Proverbs. This is the Evil. The Evil has no fear of God. The Evil is always angry. He's the fool that knows it all, with unstrained lips, talks without thinking. They're usually overbearing, and they refuse to be disciplined. This brings us to the next level of a fool, called Naval. We've kind of seen this one already, and we have a real good example of a Naval. We see this in David's life, when David and his men had protected the herdsmen and that of a man named Nabal. And David had sent his men and said, "Go, it's sheep shearing time. This is when everyone is partying. Go and receive from Nabal some gifts for having helped his men." And we know that when his men went, Nabal had spurned them, and they came back. David was angry. David's going to go back to the camp. He's going to kill Nabal. He's going to kill everyone in the camp. And we know that Abigail, Nabal's wife, quickly gathers things, goes to David and says, I am so sorry, David. My husband's name is Nabal, and so is he. He is a fool. And so we see this word, Naval, comes from the root word, which means to wither or to be dried up. And so it came to mean one who was senseless, who any common sense had been dried up out of them. They are described as being disgraceful, insensitive, morally insensible. They are close-minded, loud-mouthed, and they closely are related to the kasil, the fool, which we've already looked at. That brings us to the last level of a fool. This level is called alets. Alets, as we look at the attributes of alets, they mock wisdom. These are the scoffers. Anytime you see the scoffer does this, that's alets. They mock wisdom because it cannot be proven logically. And so he's cruel, he's arrogant, he has no fear of God, and he undermines anything and everything. You're going to see the scoffer throughout the book of Proverbs. Our week ends with Solomon reiterating what he said at the beginning. In Proverbs 6 and verse 20, we're told, my son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. He goes on to say in verse 23, for the commandment is a lamp, and teaching is light. May the light go on in our lamps this week as the Holy Spirit teaches us and gives us understanding and causes us to become wise. So once again, have a great week, and I will see you again next week.